When a $2 billion stealth bomber lost power over the Rocky Mountains, 3 elite rescue teams failed to bring it home. The pilot was trapped, the aircraft was dying, and America's most classified military secrets sat exposed on a remote mountain peak. Then a captain who had been rejected from Top Gun for being too cautious did something that broke every rule in the book. This isn't just another military story. It's about what happens when the system fails, when procedures aren't enough, and when the person nobody believes in becomes the only one who can save the day. Because sometimes, the qualities that get you dismissed are exactly the ones that make you irreplaceable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its barren landscape broken only by the occasional Joshua tree and the shimmering heat waves that rose from baked earth. Nellis Air Force Base sat like a technological oasis in this hostile environment, its runways and hangars representing decades of military aviation excellence. The base was home to the most advanced fighter pilot training in the world, where only the elite of the elite earned their wings and the right to fly America's most sophisticated combat aircraft. Captain Maria Rodriguez stepped out of the transport bus that had carried her from Las Vegas McCarran Airport, her dress blues crisp despite the punishing heat that immediately pressed against her like a physical force. The uniform bore the wings of a qualified Air Force pilot, earned through years of rigorous training and countless hours of flight time. Her service record was exemplary, her technical knowledge exceptional, and her flying skills had been consistently rated among the top 10% of her peer group. Yet something about her presence on this particular morning felt different from the other candidates who had arrived for advanced tactical training. While most pilots approached Nellis with the swagger of fighter jocks accustomed to being the best in any room, Maria carried herself with quiet confidence that suggested competence rather than arrogance. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her posture military perfect, but her eyes held the thoughtful intelligence of someone who analyzed before acting. The intake processing center buzzed with activity as newly arrived pilots checked in for what the Air Force officially called the United States Air Force Weapons School, though everyone knew it by its more famous nickname. Top Gun had become synonymous with the pinnacle of military aviation training, where the best pilots in the world came to learn advanced tactical fighting techniques. Acceptance into the program was considered the ultimate validation of a pilot's abilities and potential. Maria joined the queue of officers waiting to present their orders and complete administrative processing. Around her, conversations buzzed with the familiar bravado of fighter pilots discussing their previous assignments, combat experience, and the aircraft they had flown. F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-22 Raptors, and F-35 Lightning E's were mentioned, with the casual familiarity of pilots who had pushed these machines to their operational limits. When her turn came, Maria handed her paperwork to the staff sergeant behind the processing desk. The young enlisted man scanned her documents with routine efficiency until his eyes caught something that made him pause. His expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed confusion as he read through her flight qualifications and aircraft assignments. "Ma'am, there seems to be some kind of error in your paperwork," he said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone encountering an unexpected situation. "Your current assignment shows B-2 Spirit operations at Whiteman Air Force Base. Are you sure you're supposed to be here for fighter training?" The question drew attention from other pilots in the processing line, their conversations gradually quieting as they focused on the unusual exchange. Maria felt the weight of their collective scrutiny, understanding that her presence was already being questioned before she had even completed check-in procedures. The B-2 stealth bomber was respected throughout the Air Force, but it wasn't a fighter aircraft, and its pilots weren't typically associated with tactical combat training. "My orders are correct, Sergeant," Maria replied with calm professionalism. "I've been selected for advanced tactical training based on my overall flight qualifications and test scores. My current aircraft assignment doesn't disqualify me from fighter pilot training." The staff sergeant consulted his computer terminal, clearly seeking guidance from supervisory personnel or official documentation that would resolve the apparent discrepancy. Other pilots in line began murmuring among themselves, their voices carrying the skeptical tone of people witnessing something that didn't fit established patterns. Maria remained composed despite the growing attention, having anticipated that her unconventional background might raise questions. Captain Jake Morrison, a veteran F-22 pilot from Langley Air Force Base, stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. He wore his flight suit with casual authority, the fabric marked with patches that documented years of advanced training and operational experience. His presence commanded immediate respect from the other pilots, who recognized him as someone whose opinions carried significant weight. "Sergeant, I think there might be a real problem here," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the processing center. "The B-2 is a strategic bomber, not a tactical fighter. The flying requirements are completely different. You don't train bomber pilots in air-to-air combat, because that's not their mission. Someone in personnel must have made a mistake." The observation was delivered with matter-of-fact certainty that suggested Morrison was simply stating obvious facts rather than expressing personal opinion. Other pilots nodded in agreement, their collective experience confirming that tactical fighter training was reserved for pilots who would actually fly tactical fighters. Maria's presence seemed to violate the basic logic of military aviation. Specialization. Major Patricia Hayes, another F-22 pilot with multiple combat deployments, added her own perspective to the discussion. "The selection process for this program is incredibly competitive. Every slot is precious, and they're reserved for pilots who will actually use tactical training in operational assignments. Taking a spot from a qualified fighter pilot to train someone who flies strategic bombers doesn't make sense from a resource allocation standpoint." Maria listened to the conversation without defensiveness, recognizing that their concerns reflected genuine confusion rather than personal animosity. The Air Force did indeed prioritize tactical training for pilots who would fly tactical missions, and her presence did represent an unusual deviation from standard procedures. However, her selection had been based on comprehensive evaluation, criteria that extended beyond current aircraft assignments. The staff sergeant returned from his consultation with supervisory personnel, his expression indicating that the confusion had been resolved through official channels. "Ma'am, your orders have been verified and approved. You're cleared to continue with processing. Your sponsor will brief you on program requirements and expectations during orientation." The confirmation seemed to surprise several pilots in the processing line, though they maintained professional composure despite their obvious skepticism. Maria completed her paperwork and received her temporary base credentials, officially becoming part of the most exclusive pilot training program in the world. The administrative process was complete, but the social challenges were just beginning. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the processing center, Maria became aware of the conversations continuing around her. Pilots discussed her situation in voices that were loud enough to be overheard, but not quite loud enough to be considered deliberately disrespectful. Their comments reflected genuine bewilderment about why a bomber pilot had been selected for fighter training. But they also carried underlying implications about her qualifications and potential. Captain Brad Stevens, an F-35 pilot from Hill Air Force Base, expressed what many others were thinking. "I've never seen anything like this before. The selection criteria are supposed to ensure that only the most qualified tactical pilots get training slots." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Either the standards have changed dramatically, or someone in personnel made a serious error. Either way, it's going to make for an interesting few months. Morrison nodded in agreement, his expression reflecting the concern of someone who took pilot training seriously. The program is designed to push experienced fighter pilots to their absolute limits. The academics are brutal, the flying is dangerous, and the washout rate is significant even for people who have been flying fighters for years. I can't imagine how someone transitions from strategic bombing to tactical air combat. Maria understood their concerns because she shared many of them herself. Her background in B-2 operations had prepared her for precision flying and complex system management, but tactical air combat required different skills and instincts. The transition would be challenging, potentially overwhelming, and success was far from guaranteed, even with extensive preparation and determination. Hayes added her own professional assessment of the situation. The B-2 is an incredible aircraft that requires exceptional piloting skills, but it's designed for completely different mission profiles. Strategic bombing emphasizes careful planning, precise navigation, and system management. Tactical fighting requires split-second decision-making, aggressive maneuvering, and instinctive reactions to rapidly changing threats. The skill sets don't necessarily overlap. The observation was accurate and reflected the fundamental differences between strategic and tactical aviation. Maria had spent years mastering the complex systems and precise procedures required for stealth bomber operations, but she had limited experience with the aggressive, instinctive flying that characterized air-to-air combat. Her selection for tactical training represented a significant career shift that would test abilities she had never fully developed. As the processing center gradually emptied, Maria found herself increasingly isolated from the social dynamics that bonded other pilots together. Their shared experiences flying tactical aircraft created natural connections and mutual understanding. That excluded her by default. She wasn't being deliberately ostracized, but she also wasn't being welcomed into the informal networks that made military training more manageable. The base orientation tour took her through facilities that represented the pinnacle of military aviation training. Flight simulators capable of replicating any combat scenario occupied entire buildings. Briefing rooms contained classified tactical information that shaped modern air warfare. The aircraft parking areas displayed the most advanced fighter jets in the world, their sleek profiles representing decades of technological development and billions of dollars in research and development. Maria's sponsor, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Chun, provided professional guidance about program expectations and requirements. His manner was courteous but somewhat distant, suggesting that he too was uncertain about her presence in a program designed for tactical fighter pilots. The briefing covered academic requirements, flight training schedules, and evaluation criteria that would determine her success or failure over the coming months. The Advanced Tactical Training Program is extremely demanding, Colonel Chun explained as they toured the academic facilities. Students are expected to master complex tactical doctrine, threat recognition, electronic warfare principles, and advanced weapon systems. The curriculum assumes extensive background knowledge in air-to-air combat fundamentals. Your B-2 experience will be valuable for some aspects of the program, but you'll need to work exceptionally hard to catch up in areas where you lack tactical fighter background. The warning was delivered with professional honesty rather than discouragement, but Maria understood the implications clearly. She would be competing with pilots who had years of tactical experience, while she struggled to master basic concepts they took for granted. Success would require extraordinary effort and exceptional aptitude, with no guarantee that hard work would overcome the fundamental disadvantages of her unconventional background. As the day progressed, Maria attended mandatory briefings and completed administrative requirements that formalized her entry into the program. Other students were friendly enough in professional settings, but social interactions remained limited by the obvious differences in their backgrounds and experiences. She was the bomber pilot among fighter pilots, the methodical strategist among aggressive tacticians, the careful planner among instinctive warriors. The officers' quarters where she would live for the next several months were standard military accommodations, functional but comfortable. Her neighbors were all tactical fighter pilots with years of combat experience and advanced training. Their conversations in the hallways and common areas centered on topics that were foreign to her experience: dogfighting techniques, missile engagement envelopes, and aerial combat maneuvering that had never been part of her operational responsibilities. That evening, Maria sat in her small room, reviewing the massive stack of academic materials that would consume her attention for the foreseeable future. The textbooks covered tactical doctrine, threat analysis, weapon systems, and combat procedures. That represented entirely new knowledge domains. While other students would be reviewing familiar concepts, she would be learning foundational information that they had mastered years earlier. The first day at Nellis had confirmed her expectations about the challenges ahead. She was technically qualified for the program, but her background created social and academic barriers that would be difficult to overcome. The other students weren't hostile, but they were skeptical about her ability to succeed in a program designed for tactical fighter pilots. Their doubts were reasonable given the fundamental differences between strategic bombing and tactical air combat. Maria understood that proving herself would require exceptional performance in every aspect of the program. Academic excellence, flight training proficiency, and tactical competence would all be necessary to demonstrate that her selection had been justified. Failure would confirm the suspicions of those who questioned her qualifications, while success would challenge established assumptions about pilot specialization and career development. The window in her quarters overlooked the flight line where F-16s and F-22s sat ready for the next day's training missions. Soon she would be flying these aircraft, pushing them to their operational limits while learning the aggressive tactics that defined modern air combat. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, representing the ultimate test of her abilities as a military pilot. As she prepared for bed, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Years of careful preparation, exceptional performance evaluations, and competitive selection had earned her this opportunity. Now she faced the challenge of proving that a bomber pilot could master the skills and instincts required for tactical air combat. The next few months would determine whether her career would reach new heights or end in failure that validated every doubt about her unconventional selection. The desert night was quiet except for the distant sound of aircraft engines and the soft hum of air conditioning systems working against the Nevada heat. Tomorrow would bring her first academic classes and flight training sessions, where she would begin the process of either proving her capabilities or confirming the skeptics' expectations. Either way, she was committed to giving everything she had to succeed in the most challenging pilot training program in the world. Outside her window, the lights of Las Vegas glittered on the horizon like a reminder of the world beyond military aviation. But Maria's attention was focused entirely on the immediate challenges ahead, the textbooks that needed to be mastered and the flying skills that needed to be developed. She had earned her place in this program through merit, and she intended to prove that careful preparation and methodical excellence could succeed even in an environment designed for aggressive instincts and split-second decisions. The alarm clock on her nightstand was set for 0500 hours, beginning what would be one of the most demanding periods of her military career. As she drifted off to sleep, Maria's last thoughts were of the aircraft she would fly tomorrow and the tactical maneuvers she would attempt. Success or failure would ultimately be determined by her ability to adapt strategic thinking to tactical requirements, proving that different approaches to aviation could be equally effective when applied with sufficient skill and determination. Captain Maria Rodriguez, stood at attention in the sterile hallway outside the flight operations office at Whiteman Air Force Base. Her dress blues were pressed to perfection, her posture military straight, but the manila envelope in her hands felt heavier than any piece of equipment she'd ever carried. Inside were her credentials, her flight records, and her formal application for advanced tactical training. What everyone called Top Gun, though the official designation had changed years ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the polished linoleum floor. Other pilots walked past without making eye contact. Word traveled fast on military bases, and everyone already knew why she was there. Some nodded politely. Others pretended not to see her at all. A few younger officers whispered as they passed, their conversations dying the moment they thought she might overhear. Major David Thompson's office door bore his name in black lettering on frosted glass. Through the semi-transparent surface, Maria could see his silhouette bent over paperwork. She had requested this meeting 3 weeks ago. The delay itself had been a message, though not one anyone would admit to sending. Thompson was known for his efficiency, his ability to make quick decisions. When he wanted to see someone, meetings happened within hours. When he didn't, they happened eventually. Maria knocked twice, sharp and professional. A gruff voice called for her to enter. Thompson didn't look up immediately when she stepped inside. His office was standard military issue: metal desk, filing cabinets, motivational posters about teamwork and excellence. A single personal touch sat on his windowsill, a model F-16 painted in Thunderbird's colors. Thompson had flown with the demonstration team 15 years earlier, before a back injury grounded him from high-G maneuvers. Finally, he raised his eyes from the paperwork. His expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who had already made a decision and was simply going through the motions of process. Maria placed the envelope on his desk and remained standing. Thompson picked it up, though he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he set it aside and leaned back in his chair. "Your flight record is impressive, Rodriguez. Advanced pilot training finished second in your class. Instructor certification completed ahead of schedule. No disciplinary actions, no safety violations. Your commanding officers speak highly of your technical knowledge and your reliability." Thompson paused, his fingers drumming once against the desk surface. These are all valuable qualities for a pilot. Maria sensed the conjunction coming before he spoke it. Thompson's tone had the cadence of someone delivering prepared remarks, words he had rehearsed to sound supportive while delivering rejection. She kept her expression neutral and waited. "However," Thompson continued, "tactical fighter training requires a specific mindset, aggressive decision-making under extreme pressure, split-second choices in life-or-death scenarios, the ability to take calculated risks when hesitation means failure." He opened the envelope now, though Maria suspected he had already reviewed its contents multiple times. These skills can't be taught in a classroom or measured on a written exam. They're instinctive qualities that either exist or they don't. The Major pulled out Maria's psychological evaluation, a document she had spent 3 hours completing under the supervision of a military psychiatrist. The questions had been probing, designed to measure risk tolerance, aggression levels, and competitive drive. Maria had answered honestly, which now seemed like a strategic error. "Your evaluation shows exceptional analytical thinking and careful risk assessment," Thompson said. "You're methodical in your approach to problem solving. You consider multiple variables before making decisions. These are strengths in many aviation contexts." He set the document down with deliberate precision. "But in tactical combat situations, overthinking can be fatal. Fighter pilots need to trust their instincts and act decisively, even with incomplete information." Maria had expected this critique. Throughout her career, supervisors had praised her careful planning and thorough preparation. While simultaneously questioning her killer instinct, She had heard variations of this conversation before, though never delivered with such finality. The unspoken message was always the same. She was too cautious for the highest levels of military aviation. Thompson continued reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. The selection board has reviewed your application carefully. While your technical qualifications are outstanding, we don't believe tactical fighter training aligns with your natural flying style. Your skills would be better utilized in transport operations, training roles, or support missions that benefit from methodical planning rather than split-second aggression. The words hung in the air between them. Maria had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so directly still felt like a physical blow. She had trained for this opportunity for years, had built her entire career around the goal of flying the most advanced aircraft in the military inventory. Now that path was being closed off with bureaucratic language about alignment and utilization. We're recommending you for the B-2 program instead, Thompson said, his tone shifting slightly as if he were offering compensation for disappointment. It's highly specialized work. Very few pilots qualify for stealth operations. The aircraft requires exceptional precision and system knowledge. It's important work, Rodriguez. Critical to national security. Maria understood what he wasn't saying. The B-2 was for pilots who were too careful for fighters, but too skilled for cargo planes. It was a prestigious assignment that felt like consolation. Flying the most expensive aircraft ever built should have been an honor, but it came wrapped in the implication that she wasn't quite good enough for the real action. The meeting was clearly over. Thompson slid the paperwork back into the envelope and handed it across the desk. Maria took it without comment. Her application for tactical fighter training had been officially denied. Her alternate assignment to the B-2 program had been approved. Everything was settled, documented, and filed in the appropriate bureaucratic channels. "Thank you for considering my application, sir," Maria said. Her voice was steady, professional. No trace of disappointment or frustration leaked through. Thompson nodded approvingly. This was how rejection was supposed to be handled in the military, with grace and immediate acceptance of authority decisions. "You'll report to Colonel Mitchell for B-2 orientation next Monday," Thompson said. "It's a good assignment, Rodriguez. Make the most of it." Maria saluted, received the perfunctory response, and left the office. The hallway seemed longer on the way out. Other pilots were going about their business, but their conversations felt muted and distant. She walked past the flight board where mission assignments were posted daily. Fighter squadrons had their names listed in bold letters beside tactical exercises and training missions. The B-2 operations were listed separately in smaller print with fewer details. Outside the building, the Missouri heat pressed down like a weight. Maria stood on the concrete steps, looking across the flight line where aircraft sat in neat rows. F-16s and F-22s gleamed in their gray paint schemes, sleek and purposeful. Further away, partially hidden in specialized hangars, the B-2s waited like angular shadows. She could see maintenance crews working on one of the stealth bombers, their movements careful and deliberate around the aircraft's distinctive shape. Maria walked to her car slowly, processing what had just happened. The rejection itself wasn't a surprise, but the finality of it was settling over her like fog. There would be no appeals, no second chances, no opportunity to prove that careful didn't mean timid. The decision was made, and her career trajectory was now set along a different path entirely. As she drove away from the operations building, Maria passed the flight training facility where new pilots learned the basics of military aviation. Through the windows, she could see instructors pointing at diagrams, explaining aerodynamics and emergency procedures to eager students. They all dreamed of flying fighters, of being the elite few selected for the most challenging missions. Most of them would be disappointed, redirected into other specialties based on evaluations and assessments that reduced complex human capabilities to check marks on forms. The base housing area was quiet in the afternoon heat. Maria's small apartment was standard military quarters. Functional furniture, white walls, minimal decoration. She set the envelope on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long moment. Inside were her dreams, officially rejected and neatly filed. Also inside was her new assignment, a consolation prize that would define the rest of her military career. She opened the envelope one more time and read through Thompson's comments. Methodical, analytical, careful risk assessment. These were criticisms disguised as compliments, suggestions that her natural instincts were fundamentally incompatible with elite aviation. The psychological evaluation painted a picture of someone who thought too much and acted too slowly, someone better suited for routine operations than split-second combat decisions. Maria had heard these descriptions throughout her life. Teachers had called her thorough but not dynamic. College professors had praised her research skills while questioning her leadership potential. Flight instructors had commended her technical knowledge while noting her tendency to over-prepare for simple exercises. The pattern was consistent: high marks for competence, low marks for instinct. But Maria knew something that didn't show up in evaluations or psychological profiles. Her careful preparation wasn't about fear or hesitation. It was about understanding systems so completely that she could operate beyond their normal parameters when necessary. Her methodical approach wasn't slow thinking. It was deep thinking that allowed for faster, more accurate responses when situations went wrong. The evaluator saw caution where Maria saw preparation for chaos. The B-2 assignment was meant to be a suitable role for her particular skills. Flying a stealth bomber required patience, precision, and careful attention to complex systems. It was important work, but it wasn't the work she had trained for. Maria folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. Her fighter pilot dreams were over, but her aviation career was just beginning along a path she had never planned to take. The social exclusion, the officers' club at Whiteman Air Force Base, buzzed with the familiar energy of military personnel. Unwinding after duty hours. Pilots clustered around high tables, their flight suits unzipped to the waist, telling stories that grew more dramatic with each beer. The Friday evening crowd was dominated by fighter pilots from the visiting tactical squadrons, their conversations loud enough to carry across the room. Maria Rodriguez sat alone at a corner table, nursing a Coke and watching the social dynamics play out around her. Captain Brad Harrison commanded attention at the center of the largest group. His Top Gun patch was prominently displayed on his flight suit, though regulations technically prohibited wearing it in the club. Harrison had graduated from the weapons school 2 years earlier and never let anyone forget it. His stories always featured himself as the hero, whether he was describing training exercises or recounting his single combat deployment. Other pilots laughed at his jokes and nodded along with his tactical analyses, the social hierarchy of military aviation clearly established through official achievements and unofficial charisma. Maria had been attending these Friday gatherings for 3 months, ever since her assignment to the B-2 program became official. She told herself it was important to maintain relationships with other pilots, to stay connected to the broader aviation community on base. In reality, she kept coming because the alternative was acknowledging that she no longer belonged in these circles. The rejection from tactical fighter training had created an invisible barrier between her and the pilots she had once considered peers. Harrison's voice carried across the room as he launched into another story. So there I am, inverted at 15,000 feet, this bandit right on my 6. My Rio is screaming that we're locked up, telling me to brake left. But I knew something he didn't. I had been tracking this guy's patterns all week during exercises. He always broke right after a lock-on, always tried to reverse the position by diving into a split S. So instead of defensive maneuvering, I chopped the throttles and let him overshoot. The group leaned in, even though most of them had heard variations of this story before. Harrison paused for dramatic effect, taking a long drink from his beer before continuing. The guy shot past me like I was standing still. Suddenly, I'm in perfect position for a gun's kill. Training exercise over, bandit down. Harrison emerges victorious once again. He spread his arms wide in mock triumph, drawing cheers from his audience. Lieutenant Sam Parker, one of the younger pilots, glanced toward Maria's table and then back to Harrison. "What about Rodriguez?" he asked, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Doesn't she fly combat missions now?" "The B-2 is technically a bomber." The question created a momentary silence that felt heavier than the ambient noise. Harrison followed. Parker's gaze to Maria's corner table, his expression shifting from jovial to dismissive. "That's not really the same thing, kid," he said with patronizing patience. "Stealth bombers don't dogfight. They drop ordnance from altitude and head home. It's more like flying a very expensive delivery truck." The comparison drew chuckles from the group, though some of the older pilots looked uncomfortable with the characterization. Major Chris Wallace, a veteran F-16 driver with deployment experience, started to object. "Actually, the B-2 requires," he began, but Harrison cut him off with a wave. "Look, I'm not saying it's not important work," Harrison continued, his voice loud enough to ensure Maria could hear every word. "Strategic bombing has its place in modern warfare. Someone has to fly the assets that can't defend themselves. But let's not pretend it's the same as air-to-air combat. When was the last time a bomber pilot had to think on their feet? When did? They have to make split-second life-or-death decisions with an enemy actively trying to kill them." Parker looked genuinely confused. "But doesn't the B-2 cost like $2 billion? Wouldn't they put their best pilots in the most expensive aircraft?" Harrison laughed, a sound that carried no humor. "Kid, you're thinking about it backwards. They put careful pilots in expensive aircraft because they can't afford to lose them to aggressive flying. Fighter pilots take risks because that's the job. Bomber pilots follow flight plans because deviation costs too much money. It's a completely different mindset." The explanation seemed to satisfy Parker, though Maria noticed that some of the senior officers were avoiding eye contact with anyone else. The social lesson was clear. Bomber pilots occupied a different category entirely, valued for their reliability rather than their skill. Harrison was establishing the hierarchy that placed fighter pilots at the top of the aviation food chain, with everyone else serving in supporting roles. Maria finished her Coke and considered leaving, but walking out during Harrison's performance would only confirm his narrative about bomber pilots lacking backbone. Instead, she remained seated and listened as the conversation evolved into a broader discussion about the differences between various aircraft assignments. Transport pilots were dismissed as bus drivers. Cargo haulers were described as flying truck drivers. Even helicopter pilots were characterized as useful, but not quite real aviators. The pattern was familiar to Maria from her years in military aviation. Every specialty developed its own culture and mythology, with fighter pilots consistently positioned at the apex of skill and courage. The social structure was reinforced through stories, patches, informal rankings, and subtle exclusions. Pilots who didn't make the cut for fighters learned to find value in their assigned roles, while accepting their position in the unofficial hierarchy. Harrison's voice rose again as he transitioned to a new topic. "You know what the difference is between a fighter pilot and a bomber pilot?" He paused for effect, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "A fighter pilot knows that every mission could be their last, so they train like their life depends on it. A bomber pilot knows that every mission will probably be routine, so they train like their career depends on following procedures." The joke wasn't particularly clever, but it drew the expected laughter from his audience. Maria recognized the underlying message. Fighter pilots were warriors while bomber pilots were technicians. The distinction wasn't about skill or intelligence. It was about courage and willingness to face danger. Harrison was positioning himself and his fellow fighter pilots as the true guardians of American airspace, with everyone else playing supporting roles. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, one of the few female pilots in the room, tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. "I heard the B-2 is actually really difficult to fly," she said. "The fly-by-wire system is supposed to be incredibly complex. Doesn't it require special training?" Harrison nodded magnanimously, as if acknowledging a minor point that didn't affect his larger argument. "Oh, absolutely. The technology is impressive. Stealth coding, advanced avionics, computerized everything. It's like flying a space shuttle. But that's exactly my point. The aircraft does most of the thinking. The pilot just has to monitor systems and follow procedures. It's high-tech, but it's not high skill in the traditional sense." Maria wanted to object, to explain that the B-2's fly-by-wire system was actually more demanding than conventional aircraft, requiring pilots to understand complex interactions between computer control and manual override. The stealth technology created unique challenges that demanded exceptional situational awareness and system knowledge. But any defense of her aircraft would only reinforce the perception that bomber pilots were defensive about their assignments. Wallace made another attempt to balance the conversation. "Different missions require different skills," he said carefully. "Air-to-air combat tests reaction time and tactical thinking. Strategic bombing tests precision and system management. They're both important capabilities." "That's true," Harrison agreed, his tone suggesting magnanimous concession. "But when people talk about the best pilots in the Air Force, they're not thinking about system management. They're thinking about the guys who can win dogfights, who can adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations, who can make life or death decisions in seconds. That's why Top Gun exists. That's why fighter pilots have the reputation they do." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew that Maria had been rejected from tactical fighter training. Harrison wasn't addressing her directly, but his words were clearly meant for her to hear. The message was unmistakable. She had been evaluated and found lacking in the qualities that defined elite aviation. Her assignment to the B-2 program was evidence of limitation, rather than opportunity. Parker, still trying to understand the social dynamics, asked another question. "So are you saying that bomber pilots couldn't handle fighter training? That they're not good enough for Top Gun?" Harrison's answer was delivered with practiced diplomacy. "I'm saying that different people have different strengths. Some pilots are naturally aggressive and instinctive. Others are naturally methodical and careful. The Air Force does a good job of matching people to roles that suit their personalities. Fighter pilots and bomber pilots serve different functions, but both are necessary." The response was politically correct, but carried an unmistakable implication. Bomber pilots were placed in their roles because they couldn't handle the demands of fighter aviation. Their careful, methodical approach was presented as a limitation rather than a strength. Harrison was being polite while simultaneously reinforcing every stereotype about bomber pilots being less capable than their fighter counterparts. Maria finally stood up, placing her empty glass on the table with deliberate care. The movement drew glances from around the room, though no one spoke directly to her. She had learned that the best response to exclusion was dignified withdrawal rather than confrontation. Arguing would only confirm the perception that bomber pilots were defensive about their secondary status. As she walked toward the exit, Maria could hear Harrison launching into another story about his tactical exploits. The conversation resumed its normal rhythm, as if her presence had been irrelevant to the discussion. She pushed through the club's front door and stepped into the warm Missouri evening, leaving behind the laughter and camaraderie that no longer included her. The walk back to her apartment took her past the flight line, where aircraft sat silent under security lights. In the distance, She could see the distinctive triangular silhouettes of the B-2 bombers in their specialized hangars. Tomorrow she would be flying one of those aircraft, operating technology that most pilots would never have the opportunity to touch. But tonight, she was just another pilot who hadn't made the cut for the elite ranks of military aviation. The problem revelation. The morning briefing room at Whiteman Air Force Base felt different than usual. Colonel James Mitchell stood at the front of the room with an expression that immediately commanded attention from the assembled pilots and crew chiefs. His typical pre-flight meetings were routine affairs: weather updates, maintenance status, reports, and mission schedules delivered with military efficiency. Today, tension filled the air like humidity before a storm. Something significant had happened, and everyone could sense it before the colonel spoke a single word. Maria Rodriguez sat in the third row, her flight suit crisp and her notebook ready for the standard operational briefing. Around her, other B-2 crew members shifted in their chairs, with the restless energy of people waiting for bad news. The stealth bomber program operated with minimal drama most of the time. Training flights followed predictable patterns. System checks were conducted according to detailed protocols. Emergencies were rare enough to be noteworthy when they occurred. Mitchell's voice cut through the murmur of side conversations. At approximately 0347 hours this morning, we lost contact with Ghost Rider during a routine navigation exercise. The aircraft was conducting low-level terrain following over the Colorado Rockies when radio communications ceased. Weather conditions at the time included severe thunderstorm activity, with multiple lightning strikes reported in the area. The room fell completely silent. Ghost Rider was one of only 21 B-2 bombers in existence, each aircraft representing over $2 billion in development and construction costs. More importantly, Captain Jake Morrison was piloting the mission, a veteran with 8 years of stealth bomber experience and a spotless safety record. Morrison was respected throughout the squadron for his technical knowledge and steady performance. Under pressure. Initial search and rescue efforts located the aircraft approximately 40 minutes after the communication loss. Mitchell continued. Ghost Rider is intact but severely damaged. The pilot is alive but unable to safely eject due to the aircraft's current position and condition. Weather conditions continue to deteriorate in the area, limiting rescue helicopter access to the crash site. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she processed the implications. A damaged B-2 represented both a human crisis and a national security nightmare. The aircraft's stealth technology was among the most closely guarded secrets in the American military arsenal. If Ghost Rider couldn't be recovered or destroyed, its advanced systems could potentially fall into hostile hands. The political and strategic consequences would be catastrophic. Mitchell clicked a remote control, and a satellite image appeared on the briefing room screen. The photograph showed Ghost Rider sitting on what appeared to be a narrow mountain plateau, its distinctive triangular shape clearly visible against the rocky terrain. Even from the satellite's perspective, damage to the aircraft was obvious. Sections of the stealth coating appeared to be missing or scorched. One wing showed signs of structural stress, and the landing gear appeared to be partially collapsed. The aircraft sustained multiple lightning strikes during the thunderstorm, Mitchell explained. Primary flight computers are offline. Backup navigation systems are non-functional. Radio communication is sporadic at best. The pilot reports that manual flight controls are severely compromised, and the fly-by-wire system is cycling between partial function and complete failure. Captain Lisa Hayes, the squadron's senior pilot, raised her hand. What about helicopter extraction? Can't we get Morrison out and worry about the aircraft later? Mitchell shook his head grimly. The plateau is approximately 8,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by steep terrain that makes helicopter approach extremely dangerous. Weather conditions include sustained winds of 45 knots with gusts exceeding 60. Visibility is near zero due to cloud cover and precipitation. Even if we could get a helicopter close enough, the aircraft's position makes crew extraction nearly impossible without moving the bomber first. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as pilots processed the information. Maria understood the tactical situation immediately. Ghost Rider was stranded in a location that made conventional rescue impossible. The aircraft was too damaged to fly normally, but too valuable to abandon. Morrison was trapped inside a multi-billion-dollar aircraft. That represented years of technological development and strategic advantage. Major David Thompson, the flight operations chief, stood up from his position near the front of the room. "We've been in contact with Edwards Air Force Base and the manufacturer's technical support team. 3 potential solutions have been identified, but each presents significant challenges and risks." Mitchell nodded for Thompson to continue. The Major clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed technical diagram of the B-2's flight control systems. Option 1 involves attempted repair of the fly-by-wire system using portable equipment airdropped to the crash site. Technical specialists would parachute to Morrison's position and work to restore primary flight controls. Success rate is estimated at less than 30%, and weather conditions make the approach extremely hazardous. The diagram was replaced by an aerial photograph showing the terrain around Ghost Rider's position. Option 2 is controlled demolition of the aircraft to prevent technology compromise, followed by helicopter extraction of the pilot. This option guarantees Morrison's safety, but results in the total loss of a strategic asset worth over $2 billion. Political authorization for this approach is unlikely given the aircraft's value and technological significance. Maria leaned forward in her chair as Thompson described the third option. Attempted recovery flight using manual control override procedures. The pilot would attempt to fly the damaged aircraft using backup systems and manual inputs, essentially flying without computer assistance. Success would require exceptional skill and intimate knowledge of the aircraft's handling characteristics under degraded conditions. The room erupted in subdued conversation as pilots discussed the feasibility of each option. Manual flying of a B-2 was theoretically possible, but practically unprecedented. The aircraft's design relied heavily on computer-controlled stability systems. Without fly-by-wire assistance, the bomber became inherently unstable and extremely difficult to control. Few pilots had ever trained extensively in manual override procedures, and none had attempted to fly significant distances without computer assistance. Colonel Mitchell raised his hand for silence. The manufacturer's technical team has confirmed that manual recovery is possible under optimal conditions. However, current weather patterns make any flight attempt extremely dangerous. The pilot would need to navigate through severe turbulence, limited visibility, and unpredictable wind conditions while manually controlling an unstable aircraft. The margin for error is essentially zero. Thompson added his own assessment of the situation. We've contacted every B-2 pilot with manual override training. Most recommend waiting for weather conditions to improve before attempting any recovery flight. The consensus opinion is that current conditions make success unlikely and crew loss probable. Maria felt a familiar sensation, the same analytical focus that had earned her a reputation for methodical thinking. While others saw an impossible situation, she was mentally reviewing manual flight procedures and calculating risk factors. The B-2's manual override systems were complex but predictable. Weather conditions were challenging, but not necessarily prohibitive for someone with the right preparation and knowledge. Captain Brad Harrison, attending the briefing as part of a visiting tactical squadron, spoke up from the back of the room. "What about using one of the manufacturer's test pilots? Don't they have more experience with manual flying than operational pilots?" Mitchell shook his head. The company's test pilot team is currently deployed on classified projects and unavailable for emergency response. Additionally, Their manual flight experience is primarily from controlled test environments, not emergency recovery situations. We need someone with both technical knowledge and operational experience under adverse conditions. The briefing continued with detailed discussions of weather patterns, rescue coordination, and political considerations. Maria listened to the various options being debated while mentally reviewing her own qualifications for manual B-2 recovery. She had more simulator time in degraded system scenarios than most pilots in the squadron. Her methodical approach to training had led her to study manual override procedures more thoroughly than required by standard qualifications. As the meeting concluded, Maria realized that Ghost Rider represented exactly the kind of situation where her careful preparation and systematic thinking could prove invaluable. While other pilots saw an impossible challenge, she saw a complex problem with technical solutions. The question was whether anyone else would recognize that her supposedly cautious approach might be exactly what the situation required. The briefing room emptied slowly as pilots and crew members discussed the crisis in small groups. Maria remained seated, staring at the satellite image of Ghost Rider stranded on its mountain plateau. Somewhere in those Colorado peaks, Captain Morrison was waiting for rescue while sitting inside one of America's most valuable military assets. The next few hours would determine whether both the pilot and the aircraft could be saved, or whether the Air Force would face one of its most costly disasters in decades. The quiet competence display Maria Rodriguez sat alone in the squadron's technical library, a cramped room filled with maintenance manuals, system specifications, and training. Materials that most pilots avoided unless specifically required for certification updates. While her colleagues gathered in the briefing room to debate rescue options for Ghost Rider, Maria spread technical documents across the worn conference table and began the methodical analysis that had defined her approach to complex problems. Throughout her career, the B-2 flight manual lay open to Chapter 47, Emergency Procedures for Fly-by-Wire System Failure. Most pilots had read this section once during initial training and never revisited it. The scenarios described were considered so unlikely that they existed primarily to satisfy regulatory requirements rather than prepare for actual emergencies. Maria had studied these procedures extensively, not because they were required, but because she believed in understanding every aspect of her aircraft's capabilities and limitations. Her notebook filled with calculations as she worked through the mathematics of manual flight control. The B-2's inherent instability required constant computer adjustments to maintain stable flight. Without fly-by-wire assistance, the pilot had to manually compensate for the aircraft's tendency to pitch and yaw unpredictably. The computations were complex, involving weight distribution, center of gravity, control surface effectiveness, and atmospheric conditions. Most pilots relied on the computer to handle these calculations automatically. Maria's methodical nature had led her to memorize the manual override procedures years earlier. While other pilots focused on standard operational training, she had spent extra hours in the simulator practicing degraded system scenarios. Her instructors had praised her thoroughness while questioning whether such extensive preparation was necessary for routine operations. Now that preparation might prove invaluable. The technical specifications for Ghost Rider's current configuration painted a challenging but not impossible picture. The aircraft's weight was reduced due to no ordnance load and minimal fuel remaining after the emergency landing. This lower weight would actually improve manual controllability, though the pilot would need to compensate for the altered center of gravity. The damaged landing gear would require a careful approach to any recovery airfield, but manual flight control could potentially maintain stable flight to a suitable runway. Maria pulled up weather reports for the Colorado region on her laptop. The storm system that had damaged Ghost Rider was massive but predictable in its movement patterns. Satellite imagery showed a narrow window of relatively calm conditions that would open in approximately 6 hours. Wind speeds would drop to manageable levels, and visibility would improve enough to attempt visual navigation. The window would last roughly 45 minutes before conditions deteriorated again. The flight path from Ghost Rider's position to the nearest suitable airfield presented its own challenges. The route would require navigation through mountainous terrain with limited radar coverage and no GPS assistance. Visual navigation would be essential, demanding intimate knowledge of geographic landmarks and terrain features. Maria had flown training missions through the Colorado Rockies dozens of times, memorizing the distinctive peaks and valleys that could serve as navigation. References. She opened her personal flight log and reviewed her experience with manual override procedures. 3 years earlier, during a routine training flight, she had experienced a partial fly-by-wire failure that required 20 minutes of manual control before the computer system reset itself. Most pilots would have declared an emergency and landed immediately. Maria had used the opportunity to practice manual flying techniques, extending the flight to gain experience with degraded system operations. Her notebook now contained detailed calculations for fuel consumption, flight time, and control surface settings required for manual B-2 operation under current conditions. The mathematics confirmed what her intuition suggested. Recovery was possible but would require exceptional precision and extensive preparation. The margin for error was minimal, but not non-existent. Success would depend on the pilot's ability to anticipate and compensate for the aircraft's unstable characteristics throughout the entire flight. Maria glanced at her watch and realized she had been working for 3 hours without interruption. The base had grown quiet as the day shift ended and evening personnel took over essential operations. Through the library window, she could see maintenance crews working under floodlights on other aircraft, their routine activities continuing despite the crisis affecting Ghost Rider. Military operations demanded that normal functions continue even during emergencies. She gathered her notes and walked to the flight simulator building, a nondescript structure that housed the computer systems used for pilot training and proficiency maintenance. The B-2 simulator was sophisticated enough to replicate most flight conditions, including the manual override scenarios she wanted to practice. Most importantly, it could simulate the specific weather conditions and aircraft configuration that Ghost Rider would face during any recovery attempt. The simulator technician on duty was surprised to see Maria requesting training time during off-duty hours. Emergency scenarios like the Ghost Rider situation, TYPICLLY grounded all non-essential flight operations until the crisis was resolved. Maria explained that she wanted to review manual flying procedures in case she was needed to assist with the recovery effort. The technician approved her request without question, assuming that additional preparation could only be beneficial. Inside the simulator cockpit, Maria programmed the computer to replicate Ghost Rider's exact configuration: damaged systems, reduced weight, compromised flight controls, and current weather conditions. The simulation began with the aircraft sitting on the mountain plateau, engines running but flight computers offline. Maria's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, activating manual override systems and testing control surface. Response: the first simulated takeoff attempt failed when the aircraft became uncontrollable shortly after leaving the ground. The B-2's instability without computer assistance was even more challenging than Maria had anticipated. She reset the simulation and tried again, this time making smaller control inputs and maintaining constant pressure on the rudder pedals to compensate for the aircraft's tendency to yaw unpredictably. Over the next 2 hours, Maria completed 17 simulated recovery flights. The first 12 ended in crashes as she learned to anticipate the aircraft's behavior under manual control. The 13th attempt resulted in a successful but rough landing at a suitable airfield. Attempts 14 through 17 showed progressive improvement in her technique, with the final simulation resulting in a controlled landing that met all safety parameters. Her notebook now contained detailed notes about control inputs, timing sequences, and compensation techniques required for successful manual B-2 recovery. She had identified the specific power settings, trim configurations, and approach speeds that would maximize stability during flight without computer assistance. Most importantly, she had developed muscle memory for the constant control adjustments required to maintain stable flight. Maria shut down the simulator and gathered her materials. The technical library was empty when she returned to collect her flight manuals and calculation sheets. Her analysis was complete, and her preparation was as thorough as time allowed. She had identified a viable approach to recovering Ghost Rider, though the execution would require skills and knowledge that few pilots possessed. The Base Operations Center was busy with personnel coordinating various aspects of the rescue effort when Maria arrived with her documentation. Officers huddled around computer terminals, tracking weather patterns and coordinating with search and rescue teams. Radio chatter filled the air as various agencies reported their status and capabilities. The atmosphere was tense but organized, reflecting the military's systematic approach to crisis management. Maria approached the duty officer with her analysis and simulation results. She had prepared a concise briefing that outlined the technical feasibility of manual recovery, the weather window that would make the attempt possible, and the specific procedures required for success. Her presentation was factual and understated, focusing on data rather than opinion. The duty officer reviewed her materials with interest but explained that recovery decisions were being made at levels well above his authority. He promised to forward her analysis to the appropriate command personnel but cautioned that multiple agencies were already working on solutions. Maria thanked him and left her contact information, knowing that her careful preparation might never be utilized, but satisfied that she had done everything possible to contribute to the rescue effort. Outside the operations center, Maria looked up at the clear Missouri sky and thought about Captain Morrison stranded in the Colorado mountains. Weather conditions at his location were still too dangerous for any rescue attempt, but her calculations showed that a brief window of opportunity would open in less than 3 hours. By then, she would be ready to attempt something that most pilots considered impossible, manually flying one of the world's most sophisticated aircraft through mountainous terrain in marginal weather conditions. Her methodical preparation was complete. Now she waited to see if anyone would recognize that careful planning might be exactly what this unprecedented situation required. The secure conference room at Whiteman Air Force Base buzzed with tension as senior officers debated options for recovering Ghost Rider. Colonel James Mitchell sat at the head of the polished oak table, surrounded by maps, weather reports, and technical specifications that painted an increasingly grim picture of Captain Morrison's situation. 6 hours had passed since the lightning strike, and every minute of delay reduced the chances of a successful rescue, while increasing the political pressure from Washington. Major David Thompson spread satellite imagery across the table, pointing to the narrow plateau where Ghost Rider sat disabled. The aircraft's position is actually worse than we initially thought. Ground-penetrating radar shows the plateau is unstable. Geological surveys indicate the entire rock formation could collapse if subjected to additional stress. Any heavy equipment or significant vibration could send the aircraft over the edge. General Patricia Wells, the base commander's superior, from Strategic Air Command, studied the images with growing frustration. Her presence indicated the national security implications of the crisis had elevated beyond local command authority. The Pentagon was watching every decision, and her career would be judged by the outcome of the next few hours. She turned to the assembled experts with barely controlled impatience. "What about the manufacturer's recommendations?" she demanded. "Northrop Grumman built this aircraft. They must have contingency plans for exactly this type of situation." Thompson consulted his notes carefully. Their technical team confirms that manual recovery is theoretically possible, but they strongly advise against attempting it under current conditions. The chief test pilot recommends waiting until weather conditions improve significantly. He estimates the success probability at less than 20% even under optimal circumstances. The general's expression darkened. 20% isn't acceptable when we're talking about a $2 billion strategic asset. What other options do we have? Colonel Mitchell activated the wall-mounted display screen, showing a detailed breakdown of available resources. Air rescue teams are standing by, but helicopter extraction remains impossible due to terrain and weather. Ground-based recovery would require heavy equipment that can't reach the plateau. Controlled demolition is still an option, but that guarantees total loss of the aircraft and its classified systems. Thompson added his own analysis of the political ramifications. Washington is extremely reluctant to authorize destruction of the aircraft. The B-2 program represents decades of research and development. Loss of even one bomber significantly impacts our strategic nuclear capabilities. Congressional oversight committees are already asking questions about how this situation occurred. General Wells stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where B-2 bombers sat in their specialized hangars like sleeping giants. Each aircraft represented not just enormous financial investment, but irreplaceable technological capability. The stealth bomber fleet was too small to absorb casual losses, too valuable to risk unnecessarily, and too important to abandon without exhausting every possible recovery option. She turned back to the assembled officers with decision-making, authority weighing heavily on her shoulders. I need alternatives. What personnel do we have available who might be capable of attempting manual recovery? Thompson consulted his personnel roster, though his expression suggested limited optimism. We've contacted every B-2 pilot with advanced manual override training. The consensus is unanimous that current conditions make success highly unlikely. Most recommend waiting at least 12 hours for weather improvement, but meteorological forecasts indicate the storm system will intensify rather than dissipate. The duty officer knocked and entered the conference room, carrying a manila folder that he placed in front of Colonel Mitchell. Sir, one of our pilots has submitted an analysis of manual recovery procedures. Captain Rodriguez has conducted extensive simulation testing and believes the mission is feasible within a narrow weather window. Mitchell opened the folder and scanned the contents quickly. His eyebrows raised as he reviewed Maria's detailed calculations and simulation results. The documentation was thorough, professional, and surprisingly optimistic about recovery prospects. Her analysis included specific procedures, timing requirements, and risk mitigation strategies that other pilots had dismissed as impossible. General Wells noticed Mitchell's reaction immediately. What does this pilot recommend? Mitchell read aloud from Maria's executive summary. Captain Rodriguez identifies a 45-minute weather window beginning in approximately 2 hours. She calculates manual recovery success probability at 65% using specific control techniques and flight path modifications. Analysis includes detailed fuel consumption projections and emergency landing sites along the proposed route. Thompson's expression shifted from skepticism to interest as he reviewed the technical specifications. These calculations are significantly more detailed than anything we've received from other sources. Her simulation results show successful recovery in multiple scenarios that other pilots considered impossible. General Wells examined Maria's credentials, which the duty officer had included with the analysis. Captain Rodriguez was rejected from tactical fighter training 3 months ago. Her fitness reports describe her as methodical and careful, qualities that typically don't align with high-risk aviation operations. Why should we trust her assessment when more experienced pilots disagree? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Mitchell knew that Maria's reputation for caution had limited her career opportunities, but her technical analysis was undeniably superior to anything else they had received. Her simulation results demonstrated practical solutions to problems that other pilots had dismissed without detailed investigation. Colonel Mitchell studied the documentation more carefully, recognizing the thoroughness that characterized Maria's approach to complex problems. "Sir, Captain Rodriguez has more simulator time in degraded system scenarios than anyone else in the squadron. Her manual override training exceeds standard requirements. She may lack tactical fighter experience, but her technical knowledge of B-2 systems is exceptional." Thompson nodded in agreement, though his support was clearly reluctant. Her analysis addresses specific technical challenges that other pilots haven't fully considered. The control input sequences she recommends are based on actual simulation testing rather than theoretical speculation. Her approach might represent our best chance of successful recovery. General Wells remained skeptical, her expression reflecting the bureaucratic caution that prioritized established hierarchy over innovative solutions. "Captain Rodriguez hasn't been cleared for high-risk operations. Her psychological evaluation indicates she lacks the aggressive instincts necessary for tactical aviation. Why would we trust our most valuable aircraft to a pilot who was deemed unsuitable for fighter training?" The criticism echoed the same themes that had defined Maria's career: too careful, too methodical, lacking the killer instinct that military aviation supposedly required. Mitchell found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending a subordinate whose capabilities exceeded her reputation, but whose opportunities had been limited by institutional bias. "She may approach problems differently than tactical pilots," Mitchell said carefully, "but her technical competence is unquestioned. In this specific situation, methodical preparation might be more valuable than aggressive instincts." Manual B-2. Recovery requires precision and system knowledge rather than tactical improvisation. Thompson supported Mitchell's assessment while maintaining professional diplomacy. "The manufacturer's test pilots are unavailable, and our most experienced operators recommend against attempting recovery under current conditions. Captain Rodriguez offers a viable alternative based on extensive preparation and simulation testing. Her analysis identifies solutions that others haven't considered." General Wells walked back to the satellite imagery, studying Ghost Rider's precarious position on the mountain plateau. Political pressure from Washington was mounting hourly, and congressional inquiries about the incident were already beginning. Successful recovery would demonstrate Air Force competence and preserve strategic capabilities. Failure would result in catastrophic loss and career-ending investigations. "The weather window that Captain Rodriguez identifies," she said finally. "How reliable is her meteorological analysis?" Thompson consulted the latest forecasts from the National Weather Service. Her predictions align with official meteorological projections. Conditions will improve temporarily before deteriorating again. The timing window is narrow but accurate. If we're going to attempt recovery, her projected timeframe represents our best opportunity. Mitchell sensed the general's internal struggle between institutional caution and operational necessity. Every minute of delay increased the risk to Captain Morrison, while decreasing the chances of successful aircraft recovery. Traditional approaches had proven inadequate, and conventional wisdom offered no solutions. Maria's analysis represented the only viable alternative to total loss. "What specific risks does Captain Rodriguez's plan entail?" General Wells asked. Thompson reviewed the technical specifications carefully. "Manual flight control increases the probability of pilot error and aircraft loss. Navigation through mountainous terrain without GPS assistance requires exceptional skill and geographic knowledge. Weather conditions remain marginal despite the projected improvement window. Success depends on precise execution with minimal margin for error." The general nodded grimly, understanding that all available options carried significant risks. The choice was between guaranteed loss through demolition, probable loss through conventional rescue attempts, or possible success through an unconventional approach that challenged established procedures and hierarchical assumptions. Colonel Mitchell recognized the opportunity to advocate for his subordinate's innovative solution. Captain Rodriguez has prepared extensively for this specific scenario. Her simulation testing demonstrates practical mastery of required techniques. She understands the risks and has developed procedures to mitigate them. We may not have a better option. General Wells returned to her chair and studied the assembled officers with the weight of command, responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders. The decision would affect not only Captain Morrison's life and the aircraft's fate, but her own career and the Air Force's institutional credibility. Success would validate unconventional thinking and challenge traditional hierarchies. Failure would confirm established wisdom about proper pilot selection and operational procedures. Captain Rodriguez was rejected from tactical fighter training for valid reasons, she said finally. Her superiors determined that she lacks the instinctive qualities necessary for high-risk aviation. Why should we override that professional judgment? Now? Mitchell chose his words carefully, knowing that his response would determine whether Maria received authorization to attempt the rescue. Her rejection from fighter training was based on psychological evaluation, not technical competence. This situation requires system knowledge and methodical preparation rather than tactical aggression. Her specific qualifications may be uniquely suited to this challenge. Thompson added his own professional assessment. Traditional approaches have proven inadequate. Captain Rodriguez offers the only viable alternative to total aircraft loss. Her preparation has been thorough, her analysis comprehensive. The risk of failure must be weighed against the certainty of loss through other options. General Wells stood silent for a long moment, studying the satellite imagery that showed Ghost. Riders stranded on its mountain perch. Captain Morrison's life hung in the balance, along with billions of dollars in military technology and decades of research and development. The decision would require choosing between institutional prejudice and practical necessity, between established hierarchy and innovative solutions. Captain Rodriguez is not authorized for this type of operation, she announced finally. Her qualifications don't meet the standards established for high-risk recovery missions. Her psychological profile indicates she's unsuitable for operations requiring aggressive decision-making under extreme pressure. The rejection was delivered with bureaucratic finality that allowed no room for discussion or appeal. Mitchell felt frustration rising in his chest, recognizing that institutional bias was preventing practical solutions to urgent problems. Maria's thorough preparation and technical expertise were being dismissed because they didn't align with traditional expectations about pilot characteristics. We'll continue monitoring weather conditions and coordinating with traditional rescue assets, General Wells continued. If atmospheric conditions improve sufficiently, we'll authorize one of our most experienced pilots to attempt manual recovery. Until then, we maintain current protocols and await better circumstances. Thompson gathered Maria's analysis and returned it to the manila folder, effectively terminating consideration of her innovative approach. The meeting was over, the decision made, and the opportunity lost. Maria would not be authorized to attempt the rescue that her detailed preparation had shown to be feasible. As the conference room emptied, Colonel Mitchell remained seated, staring at the satellite imagery that showed Ghost Rider growing smaller and more isolated with each passing hour. Somewhere in the Colorado mountains, Captain Morrison waited for rescue while sitting inside one of America's most valuable military assets. Time was running out, weather conditions were deteriorating, and institutional prejudice had just eliminated the most thoroughly prepared rescue option. Outside the conference room, Duty officers continued coordinating conventional rescue efforts that everyone privately acknowledged would probably fail. Maria Rodriguez returned to her quarters, unaware that her detailed analysis had been reviewed and rejected by the same institutional bias that had denied her access to tactical fighter training. The system that had dismissed her as too careful now refused to trust her when careful preparation offered the only hope of success. General Wells departed for her scheduled conference call with Pentagon officials, knowing she would have to explain why the Air Force's most expensive aircraft remained stranded on a mountain plateau, while weather conditions continued to deteriorate. The decision to reject unconventional solutions would be difficult to defend if traditional approaches failed, but following established procedures provided protection against career-ending criticism. The clock on the operations center wall showed that Maria's projected weather window would open in less than 2 hours. Ghost Rider sat waiting on its precarious perch. Captain Morrison remained trapped inside, and the most thoroughly prepared. Rescue plan had been officially rejected. The Air Force would continue following established protocols, while the opportunity for innovative solutions slipped away with each passing minute. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.